So the Supreme Court just threw the midterm elections into a whole heap of uncertainty. This is a story that's still developing. We have a real fight over who controls the voting process. What happens to mail in ballots, and honestly, whether election rules can be fundamentally changed just weeks before Americans begin voting. So, on Monday, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 to lift one of the legal blocks that was on President Trump's executive order targeting mail in voting. And before we go any further, I want to sort of say that the Supreme Court did not declare Trump's order constitutional. It didn't decide the administration has the power to have unlimited authority over state elections. But what the court did do was remove a significant obstacle and really created enormous uncertainty as states prepare for November's election. So let's talk through exactly what this is. Because back in March, Trump signed an executive order that addressed federal elections and mail in ballots. And the administration had talked about the changes being necessary to protect election integrity. But the actual mechanics of this order are much broader than that description even suggests. And the order directs federal agencies to compile state specific lists of people they identify as eligible voters. It also calls for a postal service system where the mail in ballots could be transmitted only for people enrolled in state specific voter lists. And there's also additional provisions that I think involve, ballot identifiers and barcodes and federal oversight. And the order directs the Justice Department to essentially prioritize investigating and prosecute state and local election officials who issue these ballots to people that the federal government considers ineligible. Now, sit with that for a moment because a state election official determines someone is eligible to vote under the state's procedures. But a federal database now can say something different. And then what happens? Does this person get to receive a ballot? Does the postal service deliver it? Does the election worker now have to worry about doing their job, and that doing their job could lead to a federal investigation? This is where the concern really starts to deepen because federal databases, they're not always perfect. People change their names, they move, records are incomplete, things can be entered in incorrectly. And when you're talking about millions of people, even a relatively small error rate can really affect a lot of eligible voters. So the constitutional question is very straightforward. Who actually has the authority to run elections? Now, under the Constitution, states have primary responsibility for administering these elections, while Congress can establish certain federal rules. The president does not get an independent power to simply rewrite state election procedures through an executive order. It doesn't happen. This is why 23 states and the District of Columbia have challenged the administration's policy. They talk about the White House attempting to insert itself into an area where it does not have authority. We even have U.S. District Judge Indira Talwani, who agreed that there were serious legal problems, and she was one who blocked major portions of the order. She raised concerns about the administration's authority and whether federal agents could reliably construct citizenship lists without incorrectly excluding legitimate voters, because that's very hard to do. There are going to be errors, and there's even an appeals court which allowed that block to remain in place. Then the administration went to the Supreme Court. And this is where the story takes a turn. So the Supreme Court's conservative majority did not settle the underlying constitutional question. Instead, it concluded that the states had challenged the order too early. They're saying this is a timing issue. Essentially, the majority said that the states had not yet demonstrated the kind of concrete inquiry required for their lawsuit because some of the policies hadn't yet fully been implemented. In its decision, the court, they acknowledged that future actions taken under the executive order might not be lawful, but it's more of a, hey, we'll see what happens. And this is what creates the problem. Elections are not events you can simply redo after the damage is done. If a voter doesn't receive their ballot, if election offices are forced to change a system last minute, if military members overseas, experience delays, you can't rewind a calendar. And that's exactly what the dissenting justices were warning about. We had Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who was joined by Justice Elena Kagan. They both argued that the decision leaves states confronting federal interference without really waiting for the court to determine whether that interference is actually legal. They've also been said that, there is a warning about the impossible situation that this creates, and waiting until it's enforced and the election, it's already underway. And so, in other words, the window to stop the damage can disappear before the courts decide anyone has permission to challenge it. And that timing right there, that is critical. We're not talking about some hypothetical election years from now. The midterms are less than 3 months away. Election officials are already preparing ballots, updating voter information, coordinating with printers and planning, and military and overseas voters. And so this is all happening way too close for comfort. And this is really important. This is something that can affect so much. And the Supreme Court is the one sort of leading this charge. And I am going to continue following this story, continue seeing where this goes, and continue to break down what stories are happening in today that we need to keep some focus on. So continue to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.